You always hear about World War I and II. Many people have grandparents that fought in the second, and those grandparents will usually tell about their father who fought in the first. Ones specifically involving America are frequently talked about, such as the Korean and Vietnam Wars. What is one that is rarely brought up, though? My answer to that question is the Cold War. For it being such a big deal, it's hardly talked about. Many people overlook just how close to nuclear fallout we were. It is very interesting, and I feel that more people should learn about it in depth. So what was the Cold War? Well, the name can be deceiving at a glance. It was not technically a war, or at least in the sense of violence. The name makes sense with a simple rephrasing, though. It was the war that went cold. We were so close to war at many times, but miraculously avoided it. Let's get into the timeline events from the start all the way to the cooling of the tensions. The Cold War began because of the Soviet Union's governmental structure. It was a communist regime, and the United States wanted to get rid of any threat to their democracy. The thought of communism spreading to other nations scared our president. It scared citizens of the U.S. too. Mass hysteria was in full force because people were terrified at the thought of the communist spread. If it can spread to one country, then it can spread to more, and eventually to our home soil. Protecting our people from a Stalin-like rule was priority number one. The threat simply was too much to ignore. We couldn't just agree to disagree because the consequences would be dire. Officials came up with a strategy to prevent the Soviets' ideas of communism from spreading. They called this containment, which is pretty self-explanatory. How could we carry out containment? The US asked themselves this question and found an answer quickly. They'd increase money spent on defensive measures. Not just a little bit of an increase, though. We were to be fully prepared for a war with the USSR, which means we need a lot of weapons. After finding out the explosive nature of an atom splitting, we tuned focus to an atomic bomb. It worked great for World War II, so it ought to end this. Things weren't just happening here. They were doing the same thing to prepare. The Soviets tested an atomic bomb, and we were blown away by this. President Truman's response was that we'd build an even bigger one. An arms race ensued. Who can develop more of these weapons of mass destruction? Stalin ended up making the hydrogen bomb soon after us, so it was very even between the countries. The stakes were not only for these two countries, but every other country in the world was on edge. The hydrogen bomb gave birth to a fireball measuring 25 square miles. These two countries just had to get pushed past the breaking point, and it was game over for the entire planet. It is very likely that nuclear attacks would have wiped out much of Earth's population had the tension not been relieved. We don't just look back and see the threat today. People knew this was possible back then and prepared. Fallout shelters were built so people could live through such an event, and practice drills were often gone through. Everyday life changed. A possible nuclear attack was an integrated part of the day. Life revolved around the danger. This became more than a simple containment of communism. The countries were basically in competition, it seemed. Everything was done to be better than the Americans, or better than the Soviets. The arms race was the most dangerous example. But some things, surprisingly, didn't involve nuclear arsenals. We were having a space race. The fact that both were called races shows the sheer competitiveness between each other. In the midst of all of the chaos, Soviet-launched Sputnik was the first object humans had built and launched into space. Then a second blow came in. The Soviets launched a person into space before us, and their next target was the moon. But Kennedy would have none of this. They beat us to it twice, and he was going to make sure they didn't a third. In 1969, he held true to his word with the Apollo 11 mission, bringing Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the surface of the moon. It is important to touch back on the Korean War I had mentioned earlier. This was a big reason why the threat of spread was so feared. It happened in North Korea. North Korea soon invaded South Korea unprovoked. The US was to support South Korea. That made it seem like something larger. It wasn't just an attack on their southern neighbor, but an attack on America too. If a communist nation will attack a country like that, knowing our relation to it, they will attempt to invade others. It was seen as a seed that would eventually grow into a world of communism if not dealt with. The thought of communism knocking on America's door was a scary one. It would later turn out that it was all too real. Cuba had adopted it, and now we had communism mere miles away from the coast of our nation. The Cubans got along with the Soviets just fine, and that was the second blow. We had communism a short plane ride from our country, and enemy number one had great ties with it. The fact that Fidel Castro had demolished any good feelings between our countries was the icing on the cake. Something had to be done because now it was 2-on-1 right outside our borders. We attempted to fix this but failed time and time again. The most prominent failure was the Bay of Pigs invasion. We had this elaborate plan to invade the country, but it could not have gone worse. Trained Cuban fighters and American troops were sent to the Bay of Pigs. The combination of the almost useless attacks by air support and naval vessels, combined with just how outnumbered we were by Castro's forces, led to them capturing 1,000 soldiers. It was a humiliating loss. The U.S. was eventually forced to give millions in supplies just for the freedom of these prisoners. It also resulted in the development of public mistrust. People had lost a bit of faith in the government, and it was rightfully so. The government had just orchestrated a poorly laid out attack that ended with zero gains and only losses. The Bay of Pigs invasion did terrible things for us. Cuba had a reinvigorated sense of power and was now angry with the U.S. The Cubans and Soviets shared a common enemy, so they conspired. A U.S. spy plane would uncover something terrifying. A recon mission over Cuba revealed that there were Soviet missiles on the island. Keep in mind that they used an intercontinental missile to launch Sputnik. Now it is very close in a range of many large cities in the U.S. Panic ensued on every level of the U.S. President Kennedy had to figure out what to do. They wouldn't just remove the missiles if he asked nicely. Meanwhile, the citizens were in absolute hysterics. People scrambled to the pre-built fallout shelters and waited for the sirens. We had something to offer, though. Missiles of our own had long been stationed in Turkey, pointed at the Soviet Union. The Soviets brought an arsenal to Cuba to make things fair almost. This made negotiating fairly easy. It was agreed that if we withdrew from Turkey, they'd withdraw from Cuba. A disaster for mankind was avoided and tensions went back down. The Cold War would remain active for some time, staying active through Kennedy's death, Nixon's resignation, and all the way to Ronald Reagan's term. Not much happened during those years, and it was soon resolved when the Soviet Union collapsed. Throughout the long span of the war, that never was, many things happened and many were prevented that could have changed the course of human history. We were at many times the press of a button away from nuclear annihilation. Things worked out even when it seemed so unlikely that they would. The U.S. benefited in some ways from the whole ordeal too. Space exploration was achieved because our rival was attempting to do it before us. This led to the moon landing, arguably one of the most famous events of all time. We can also say that we certainly succeeded in reaching the goal we had from the start. Communism is nowhere in sight, and our beloved democracy is under no threat for the foreseeable future.